Okay, I wish this didn't show my double chin so bad. Okay, The Last Indian War and the Nez Perce Story by Elliot West. Again, I'm starting on page 199. Okay, I'm going to be reading, okay? Thus Gibbon's anxious thrust for the herd at the Big Hole. If he had managed to drive most of the horses out of practical reach, Kira, be quiet, please. The bands would have been left afoot, and thus at Howard's mercy, even if Gibbon and every man under him had died. The war would have ended then or shortly afterward, but Joseph and No Heart stepped in front of disaster. The reprieve was temporary, of course, which gives the Nez Perce story some of its poignant weight. Far western horse cultures were arguably the final flourish of a phenomenon that had been moving across the planet for more than 5 millennia. From the Asian steppes to China, the Sahara, and Iberia, peoples had cultivated the horse's possibilities and found in them a burst of affluence and power. The Nez Perces, blessed with country perfect for sustaining this revolution, took it farther than most. Then, after about 5 generations, the forces that were reconstructing the nation hobbled that expansive life, and the Nez Perces were told to dismount into one more constrictive than they had ever known. In 1877, they made one last try to keep the old way alive. Ultimately, the government brought its strength to bear, but during most of the chase itself, the army and the Indians still faced off as warriors had for so long as horseback peoples. On those terms, until their final fight, the Nez Perces never lost. The Big Hole was the closest they came along the way to losing that freedom. Joseph and No Heart saved them. For all the later misguided belief in Joseph as master strategist and uber war chief, this moment, spooking the herd out of harm's way, was equal to anything done by anyone else during the war. The Nez Perces kept their horses, and by doing that, they kept what every hopeful option depended on, the power to move. By the end of August the 10th, the Nez Perces had filed away with more than 2,000 head. Gibbon's men carved up their only mount, Woodruff's sorrel, and ate it. Chapter 12. Toward Buffalo Country. Meanwhile, Howard was camped at the upper end of the Bitterroot Valley, 3 days and 100 miles behind. On August 6th, when he was at some hot springs on the eastern side of Lolo Pass, a courier had arrived with Gibbon's plan of pursuit and a request that Howard come ahead with cavalry support. Howard told his infantry to hurry along behind him, and during the next 3 days he and 200 mounted men covered about 75 miles. "We live on hard bread, bacon, and occasional potatoes," one wrote. On the 10th, as Gibbon's men were dug into their thirsty benchland staving off disaster, Howard cut loose with 20 of his best horses and 17 Indian scouts and made fully 53 miles, camping over the divide at Ross Hole, less than 20 miles from the Big Hole. Nez Perces after Big Hole kept their horses. That night, 7 refugees from the battle stumbled in and reported that Gibbon was barely hanging on. Howard sent word for his cavalry to catch up quickly, then set off before dawn on August 11th to find Gibbon. Around 10 o'clock that morning, he arrived to find the Nez Perces gone and the survivors all right and cheerful. Able men were bathing and washing clothes as the injured awaited treatment. Gibbon had sent urgent dispatches for medical help, which had missed Howard but had reached the cavalry behind him, and the next day the doctors Charles Alexander and John Fitzgerald would arrive after riding through 53 miles of mountains without rest. Now, however, Gibbon lay crudely bandaged and resting. Howard greeted him, asked for a pair of slippers, and settled in for a talk. 23 troops and 6 citizens had been killed 34 officers and men and 4 civilians wounded. 7 of the 17 officers were killed or injured. 2 of the wounded, one of them English, would die in the days ahead, with the casualty rate approaching 40%. Judging the battle a victory would be a stretch. J.B. Catlin, leader of the civilian volunteers, was invited to take part in a celebration of the battle. "I don't know what we'd celebrate," he reportedly answered. "The Indians kicked the hell out of us." Unquote. As troops buried their dead, Howard's Bannock scouts dug up Nez Perce corpses, mutilated, and scalped them. Ew! That's really gross. Mutilated and scalped them, and that is so gross. And that night performed dances with the trophies. The remains were left on the field. It was a dreadful sight. More squaws were killed than men. One of Howard's officers wrote to his wife, "I have never been in a fight where women were killed, and I hope never to be." Unquote. Stevensville merchant Henry Buck recognized a woman sitting up in her grave, half covered, and wearing a dress made from calico cloth he had sold her only days earlier. Oh, sad. Wolves and grizzlies later pulled out and fed on bodies from both sides. Gibbon turned over 50 of his uninjured infantry to Howard, and on August 13th set off with his wounded for Deer Lodge. On the way, they met a large civilian party coming to ease the troops' troubles with bandages, medicine, and wagons full of chicken, mutton, cases of jam, oysters, sardines, whiskey, and brandy. Howard restarted his pursuit the same day. 3 or more days behind his quarry, he followed the southeasterly trail of trampled grass and grooves left by the travois that bore the wounded, or travois. The Nez Perces now moved as fast as was feasible, caring for the wounded as best they could. Several died during the first few days and were buried at night camps. Following custom, some of the earlier elderly dropped out so not to slow down the rest. Howard's scout, John Watermelon Reddington, found an old man who sang his death song and asked to be killed. Reddington instead gave him half his bread. Oh. Howard had a dual concern. The direction of flight would take the bands very close to the town of Bannock City, Montana. Given their probable mood, that could mean serious trouble. He was also unsure where they might go next. They might curve westward back toward their home country. If so, he hoped to catch them between himself and troops left in Idaho. Or they might go east toward the plains. If so, he might catch them on his side of the mountains. If not, they might be met by forces across the Rockies and perhaps be squeezed from behind by his own men. For now, he had to be in position to move in either direction. There is no evidence to suggest that the Nez Perces considered shifting the direction of their march, but the terrible bloodletting at the Big Hole led to a change in leadership. With their faith in Looking Glass shattered, his place was taken by Lean Elk, Poker Joe, who had 2 things going for him. He knew intimately the country they were traveling and that of the projected route, and so was ideally suited to steer the bands through what was bound to be many traps and pitfalls. Yeah.
I want some more gum.
Okay, it's above the stove. Can you get a chair? And as a mixed blood who had joined the column only in the Bitterroot Valley, he was not associated with any particular band, was outside any rivalries, and so was more likely to be widely accepted. He set a disciplined schedule of march. On the move by dawn, 4 hours of midday rest, then back on the trail until 10 in the evening. That covered good distances even while the injured were being cared for. The Big Hole had shaken up more than the Nez Perce leadership. Now none could believe that leaving Idaho had taken them into a safer world. They were in hostile territory, and the civilians they had thought were their friends had proved to be something else. Later, their most withering opinions were leveled at locals they considered despicable liars who had betrayed them when they sought some advantage for themselves. The lesson from the Big Hole was simple. All whites were against them.